Strengthening the new nation. In this unit of study, we'll see how the United States moved its government from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution of the United States. We'll also focus on the first administrations of Washington and John Adams. American history students should be able to answer the following focus questions by the completion of this unit of study. What were the strengths and weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation? How did they prompt the creation of the new U.S. Constitution in 1787? Second, what political innovations did the 1787 Constitutional Convention develop for the new nation? Third, what were the debates surrounding the ratification of the Constitution? Explain how they were resolved. Fourth, in what ways did the Federalist vision for the United States differ from that of the Republican opponents during the 1790s? And five, assess how the attitudes towards Great Britain and France shaped American politics in the late 18th century. Power to the people, forging a new nation. What Americans feared the most was the government's abuse of power. What they saw in Europe was in the proper role and scope of government is a question that needed to be asked. The new nation was in any sense 13 independent squabbling states, which was promised under the Articles of Confederation their sovereignty, freedom, and independence. Forging a new nation, the transition from world peace is never easy. Americans were not getting self-sustaining nation. There was huge challenges ahead. First and foremost was an economy. This war debt-related debt of $160 million. Three fundamental questions shaped political debate during the last quarter of the 18th century. First, where would sovereignty reside in the new nation? Second, what is the proper relationship in the states to each other and to the national government? And third, what was required for the new republic to flourish as an independent nation? The Confederation government. John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams and the future president, is credited with coining the term critical period. He used this term to discuss the importance of the years between the Treaty of Paris, 1783, and the Constitutional Convention, 1787. During this period, the nation was governed by the Articles of Confederation and state constitutions. Many at the time viewed political participation and leadership in the states as more important than the national level. During the critical period, debates emerged on how much power the national, state, and local governments should have, and where, when, and how their powers should overlap. A confederation is a loose alliance. In this case, the alliance was comprised of the 13 states that had declared independence from Britain in the Declaration of Independence. Once the Articles of Confederation were ratified, they immediately went into effect. This occurred during the American Revolution. Under the Articles, there was no executive branch of the government to oversee the coordination of the laws Congress passed. That was Congress's job. It was felt that having an executive branch was too much like having a king, and that was something the framers of the Articles wished to avoid. The Second Continental Congress would establish a government among the 13 states. Each state would have one equal vote. The government could declare war, sign treaties, borrow money, and establish a post office. The approvals of the Articles of Confederation went into effect on March of 1781. One of the biggest problems that Congress had under the Articles was that it did not have the power to tax. It had to ask the states to give them money, and the states did not have to pay. As a result, Congress had to look elsewhere to get money to pay off its debts. Robert Morris would make the Confederation government financially stable through taxation and debt management. It increased the debt by issuing new government bonds to pay off the wartime debts. Given the power to raise taxes, the bonds will increase in value. In 1781, Morris secured a charter through the Congress to create the Bank of North America. The Newburgh Conspiracy. Congress's unstable finances affected more than just the government. In 1783, soldiers who had fought in the Revolution feared that they would never receive their land grants that they had been promised, and their pay was often late. The troops stationed at Newburgh, New York, sent a group of officers to Philadelphia to present their concerns to Congress. There they learned that others had similar concerns about the weaknesses of the Confederation Congress and the nation's finances. The officers soon found themselves involved in a scheme to align Army officers and public creditors with the nationalistic Congress by threatening a coup d'etat. Alexander Hamilton, Washington's former aide and now a New York congressman, thought that Washington would support the plan. When Washington learned about the plot, he went to the meeting held by some of the officers and helped them see that the Nuremberg conspiracy would undermine the nation's future and go against the very principles that the soldiers had fought for in the first place. Washington told officers he wished to read the more recent supportive letter from Joseph Jones. His vision had recently begun to fail, and after stumbling through the first paragraph, he reached in his pocket for a pair of spectacles. He remarked, "Gentlemen, you must forgive me. Not only have I grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country." Showing and revealing his own weakness deeply affected the officers, and some wept openly. After Washington left, they resolved not to go through with the conspiracy. The struggling Confederation. The national debt rose from 11 million to 28 million, and despite the debt, the Articles of Confederation supported the political concept of republicanism and representative government, and created land distribution and how the nation should expand and new states should be formed. Why was there so many overlapping claims to Western lands? Well, that's because going by the original charters, what we would see here that can be indicated is that here we see Massachusetts that claimed it because it goes all the way in line in Massachusetts, because at the time, New York, remember, was not an English colony. There was also Connecticut as well. So they were just below Massachusetts. And when that was claimed, of course, Pennsylvania had yet been established. Virginia, of course, claimed that this entire area was theirs as well. North Carolina, Georgia, and so forth. So this presented somewhat of a problem that needed to be resolved. The Land Ordinance of 1785. Since Congress could not tax, the national government turned to one source of income that seemed inexhaustible: the land between the Mississippi River and the western boundaries of the original colonies. Previous laws passed by the Congress had stated that these lands would not be made into colonies but be allowed to enter the Union as free states. With the passage of the Land Ordinance of 1785, one section in each township was set aside for education. As you can see in the grid system, that's number 16. There. And the whole thing was surveyed in grids for each of the territories. Land was reserved for veterans, and some sold at $1 per acre. This was written by Thomas Jefferson, and also there would be no slavery in the West. It created a grid system of surveys divided into townships of 6 square miles, 36 sections of 1 square mile each. One section in each township was set aside for education and was $1 per acre. One half was sold as complete units of a minimum of 640 acres, or one section. Because not many could afford to buy one section, arrangements were made for land companies to purchase sections and sell them off in smaller parcels. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Once a territory had established 5,000 men, they could elect an elected assembly, but the governor retained an absolute veto over its laws. The governor would be appointed by the president of the Congress. When the population of a territory reached 60,000, the people could request admission to the Union as a state on equal terms within the original 13 states, provided the new state adopted a Republican constitution. The Northwest Territory later formed the Midwestern states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota. It also barred slavery from this territory, which meant that the 5 new states could enter the Union as free states rather than slave states. Now, the ceded territory was given up by the previous states, as you could see here that were shown previously in a different slide. This was key because Maryland would not go along with the Articles of Confederation. And at that time, you needed all 13 states. When all the states gave up their cession of land, Maryland would approve the Articles of Confederation. Diplomacy. The new nation now had to develop a diplomatic corps and dispatch it to other nations to try and secure new treaties for economic and political alliances. Although the Treaty of Paris of 1783 had ended the American War for Independence and stipulated that Britain must leave the Northwest Territory, it retained a string of forts in the area. When confronted with the problem, England countered that the former colonies had not paid their debts, as also required in the treaty. The British also continued to assert their right of loyalists to the property that had been taken away from them during and after the Revolutionary War. The Continental Congress lacked sufficient power to tackle this issue, even if there had been agreement on how the best way to approach it. Spain refused to recognize the southern and western United States boundaries, denied United States free navigation of the Mississippi River, and sought to exploit the divided loyalties of Westerners. When Spain refused to let U.S. ships into Latin American ports, the U.S. gave up the right to deposit goods in New Orleans in exchange for some concessions in Latin America, a 25-year agreement pleasing Eastern merchants but angering Westerners. Kentucky and Tennessee flirted with the idea of secession from Virginia and North Carolina. General James Wilkinson.
Trade in the economy. After the war, Great Britain forbade the United States from trading with the British West Indies, which had to import most of its food. Trade with the West Indies had benefited many of the states in the past, especially those in New England and also the South. Tonnage fees were imposed by the states on British goods entering American ports, higher tariffs in some ports. And during the American Revolution, farmers who had the time primarily farmed enough to keep themselves and their families fed, were not bothered much. In some areas, the British Army freed slaves and used them as servants for themselves. During the war, Great Britain had the largest navy in the world, and since the colonies had relied on the assistance of the Navy before independence, those colonies whose economies revolved around trade were not happy when that protection was no longer provided. As a result, trade was substantially harmed. There was no stable national currency. Only 3 banks in New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. Shortage of hard money, gold, resulted in printed money in 7 states was issued to help pay debts. The Articles of Confederation. The framers of the Articles had wanted a loose organization of states with more power than the central government. While this may have been a good idea when crafted, it was not long into practice that several problems emerged. Congress could not stop one state from raising taxes on imports, while another one lowered them to persuade new customers to their markets. The same thing occurred with money. Congress could not stop states from printing money to pay their debts. Many states printed freely, with nothing of value backing the money. Such reckless decisions led to inflation and made the paper money worthless. But we do see the strengths of the Articles of Confederation. They were able to win the war. They were able to secure a peace treaty with the Treaty of Paris of 1783, and we'll look into later establishing the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. The weakness is they could not collect taxes. They had to ask states to send the money. Each state was given 1 vote, regardless of the size of the population of the state. You needed 9 out of 13 states in order to pass a law. And there was no executive branch to enforce the law or judicial branch to interpret any kind of problems that might occur between the states. The gathering crisis, Shays' Rebellion. Shea and his followers demanded a more flexible monetary policy and the right to postpone paying taxes until the post-war agricultural depression had lifted. Massachusetts had not fallen victim to the desire to print substantial amounts of money, even though it had a high property and poll taxes, taxes allowing people to vote. As a result, farmers led by Daniel Shea, a former captain in the American Revolutionary Army, held courthouses in Massachusetts hostage to prevent the courts from foreclosing on their lands due to the lack of paper currency. Militiamen were sent in to put down the rebellion, and 4 farmers ended up being killed. Many have linked this rebellion to the death knell of the Articles of Confederation. The federal government needed to be stronger to prevent similar situations from occurring across the United States. By 1785, it was apparent that the Articles of Confederation needed to be strengthened, but a major stumbling point was that to amend them, unanimous support was needed in order to make an amendment, all 13 states. And usually the state that was the biggest pain in the neck, Rhode Island. In meetings at Washington's home at Mount Vernon in Virginia, and also again at Annapolis Convention, delegates met to discuss the future of the nation. Although the Annapolis Convention was a failure, Alexander Hamilton secured from a delegation a resolution calling for a constitutional convention to strengthen the federal government, but not the Articles of the United States. Creating the Constitution. The 52 delegates to the Constitutional Convention represented a broad spectrum of U.S. citizens, lawyers, farmers, college graduates, and merchants. Each had a belief that there was at least one area in which the Articles could do a better job. It was not long before these delegates were divided into 2 camps, one for the big states such as Virginia, New York, and Pennsylvania, and the other for the small states such as Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Delaware. Missing, due to being on diplomatic business or abroad, were John Jay, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Thomas Paine. Sam Adams and John Hancock were not chosen as delegates from Massachusetts, and Patrick Henry of Virginia opposed any growth in federal government and would not participate. Madison was only 36 when he assumed a major role in drafting the Constitution. This miniature in 1783 is by Charles Wilson Peel. Drafting the Constitution. The delegates voted to conduct their meetings in secret and say nothing to the public about their discussions until their work was completed. George Washington was unanimously elected chairperson. Benjamin Franklin, the elder statesman at age 81, provided a calming and unifying influence. The work and fashion specific articles in the Constitution was directed by James Madison, who would be known as the father of the Constitution, Alexander Hamilton, Devin Moore Morris, and John Dickinson. They will represent different states. These state convention leaders shared the common goal of wanting to strengthen the young nation. 2 plans would then emerge on how to form the new government, the Virginia and New Jersey plans. Under the Virginia plan, designed by James Madison, it called for a new national government with a bicameral legislature. That means 2 houses, an executive branch and a judiciary branch. The proposal of the Virginia delegation at the 1787 Constitutional Convention calling for a national legislature, which the states would be represented according to population. The national legislature would have an explicit power to veto or overrule laws passed by state legislatures. Under the New Jersey plan, William Patterson, the man you see in the painting there, proposed 9 resolutions that would retain the Confederation. Small states responded with the New Jersey plan that kept the one state, one vote rule of the Articles, but expanded the powers of Congress and the national government. Proposals of the New Jersey delegation at the 1787 Constitutional Convention for a strengthened national government in which all states would have equal representation in a unicameral legislature. Give Congress the power to tax and regulate foreign and interstate commerce. Congressional appointment for a plural executive with no veto power and a Supreme Court. The Great Compromise. Roger Sherman of Connecticut came up with the Connecticut Plan or Great Compromise, the end result of the debate between the Virginia and New Jersey plan, which seemed to be going nowhere. The plan provided for a 2-house Congress, which the Virginia plan called for. Each state would be given equal representation in the Senate, 2 senators, but in a larger body, the House of Representatives, each state would be representing according to the size of its population. Within the Constitution, the framers established a clear separation of powers so that one entity in the new government could not be lawmaker, law enforcer, and judge. This, they hope, would provide a system in which the nation would not be dominant by one branch of the government. The president is therefore charged with ensuring that all laws passed by Congress are enforced. He does not have the authority to create laws on his own. And the Constitution created only one court in the judicial branch, the Supreme Court, and established only one member on that court, the Chief Justice. This way, Congress can create as many courts underneath the Supreme Court as deemed necessary, and many place as many judges and justices in the position as it sees fit.
The first part of the Constitution is called the Preamble and tells what those founding fathers set out to do. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, to ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America.
So this is the preamble that you just heard from the old schoolhouse rock song. It's pretty catchy. But when we're looking at the preamble, it's basically almost a thesis of what the Constitution is going to be about. So in order to form a more perfect union, the founding fathers and the framers knew that there wasn't a perfect union, but the Constitution gives it the ability to get to there. Establish justice, that's the Supreme Courts and the court system. Ensure domestic tranquility, to ensure that there's peace within the nation. Provide for the common defense, that there would be the purpose of a defense and military, but only for the defense really of the nation. Promote the general welfare doesn't mean welfare. What it means is to be able to pass a series of laws that would promote the economic prosperity of the nation. And since Adam Smith's view of capitalism was prevalent in 1776, this is how we see it written here. And to secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity, that is us who are living today. So we're going to now look at what's actually in the Constitution. The Legislature. The House of Representatives was chosen every 2 years. To be a member of the House, you have to be at least 25 years of age. The power, the sole power that is only in the House of Representatives, is that this is where all tax bills start. They have the sole power of impeachment. That means to bring charges against those who've been elected to Congress, appointed by the federal courts, and also President of the United States. And they elect a Speaker of the House. The second part of the House is the Senate, chosen every 6 years, 2 from each state. The minimum age was 30 years of age. Now, in the original form of the Constitution, it was the state legislatures that chose the 2 senators. The powers, they had the sole power to try all impeachments and also to ratify treaties and confirm appointments made by the president. Together, Congress makes the laws, they tax, raise armies, declare war, and coin money. The executive. The president is elected every 4 years, a maximum of 2 terms now, but there was not that placed in the original Constitution. They are elected by the Electoral College. Rather than having people elect a president directly, the delegates decide to assign to each state a number of electors equal to the total of that state's representatives and senators. The Electoral College system was instituted because delegacy in Philadelphia feared that too much democracy might lead to a mob rule. Also, that larger states would be able to dominate the smaller states, so the purpose was to protect the minority states. In order to be elected president, you had to be a natural born of 35 years of age. the powers of the president to execute. In a sense, the executive enforced the laws passed by Congress. They're the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. They make appointments and treaties with the consent of the Senate, and they sign or veto bills which finally make bills of Congress the law. So in the last election, the 2016 presidential election, we see the Electoral College. Mostly was between President Clinton and Trump. But what we do see is that electorals chose not to go with what the state said they had to vote for, and other people received actual electoral votes. Now, chances are they'll never become electorals again. But the whole purpose of this is there is nothing specifically stated in the Constitution how an electoral will cast their vote. And looking at the Electoral College, even though Mrs. Clinton won the popular vote and Mr. Trump won the electoral vote, and there is also the debate on whether this should be changed or not. But this is just food for thought. So you can see how the popular vote went by county. And as you can see, the majority of what is in blue that you see pictured here, that it is the big cities in which Democrats have controlled, here in Austin and of course in California, the various areas there, as well as in Chicago and Atlanta and so forth, where Republicans are very strong in the rural area. The judiciary, the Supreme Court, is composed of judges appointed by the president but confirmed by the Senate, and they're given lifetime tenures. The reason they were given lifetime tenures is because it was believed the Supreme Court wouldn't become political, to keep the politics out of it. And whenever there was a vacancy, the president would make an appointment. What I want to show you is in this bas-relief of the Supreme Court, right here in the middle. In the middle of the bas-relief, representing the great lawgivers of history, that is Moses, holding the 10 Commandments. So much for about separation of church and state, huh? Limits of the Constitution, slavery. Despite the promising opening words of the Constitution, we the people, it excluded or ignored key groups of people living in the United States during this period and focused its attention primarily on propertied white men. The reason for these exclusions are many. The biggest reason was the founders was in the form of a strong republic. First, they went after the abolishing of slavery. The dream, the republic, would have died right then and there in Philadelphia. Slave states and other states that had slavery were probably broken off and formed their own country. And one of the most difficult, potentially explosive issues of the day was that of slavery. Although in 1776 slavery had been legal and existed in each of the new states, by the time of the Constitutional Convention, 4 states had abolished it, and some other northern states were moving in that direction. Additionally, even some slave owners openly recognized at some level the contradictions between the claims of the Revolution, the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution of the enslavement of human beings and exploitation of their labor. The writers of the Constitution purposely excluded the term slavery. It would first appear in the 13th Amendment in 1865, which abolished slavery. Even the issues of representation and taxation were impacted by slavery. Northern states that had abolished slavery, as well as states that retained it but had fewer slaves, argued that slaves should not count towards the state's population for purposes of congressional representation. Southern states, on the other hand, argued that the total population of the state, free and enslaved, should be counted. In the end, the desire for compromise and constitution to strengthen the national government was led to the drafting of the so-called 3/5 compromise. This compromise held that only 3/5 of slaves, called all other persons in the Constitution, would count towards a state's population when determining congressional representation, but not for taxation. Duties would be determined by a simple majority vote in Congress, but export duties that are thought to hurt the South were forbidden. Congress would make no more laws regarding the slave trade for 20 years. That's the international slave trade. Unlike slaves, women counted as a whole person in terms of congressional representation, but women could not vote or participate in the political process. Some women, like Eliza Young Wilkinson among them, believed that they would make strides toward greater freedom after they had helped win the war through their own contributions. Judith Sargent Murray asserted that both male and female patriots had fought for American independence and liberties, so both groups should benefit equally. Despite such arguments, however, figures such as Thomas Jefferson continued to assert that rather than participate in politics, women should be content to soothe and calm the minds of their husbands, returning ruffled from political debate. The Constitution addressed immigration and naturalization primarily by authorizing Congress to establish a uniform rule of naturalization in Article 2. In addition, it also limited the presidency to only those who were born in the United States or one of the colonies that became the United States. Although he became known as the leader of a party that embraced immigrants, Jefferson expressed the desire that the United States avoid encouraging large-scale immigration out of concern that immigrants might bring ideas, experiences, and political backgrounds that conflicted with the new nation's ideals. Native Americans were also excluded from the Constitution. This partly was due to recognition that these individuals were members of their own nations, such as the Cherokee or Iroquois Confederation. Only those Native Americans who paid taxes were able to be considered citizens of the United States and receive the benefits of citizenship. The fight for ratification. The convention was completed on September 17, 1789. Now it had to be submitted to the special state conventions for ratification. Once the Constitution was submitted to each state, two distinct camps emerged. The Federalists, which included Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, published essays arguing for the ratification. The Federalist Papers, as they became known, were a collection of 85 essays written by Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay, outlining arguments in support of ratification of the proposed Constitution. These documents are considered one of the best commentaries on the Constitution from the perspective of the Federalists at the time. The most famous of the Federalist Papers is Madison's essay number 10, which addressed a major concern that many over the size of the new nation and its ability to remain united across such a vast area of land. Madison first discussed one example of democracy from history, such as the city-states of Athens, concluding that democracies themselves are dangerous because the will of people usually becomes the rule of the majority or mob rule over a minority. And in the end, all these democracies end up being taken over by tyranny. Whereas some argue that these threats would undermine the new nation's existence, Madison asserted that the flaw inherent to democracy, the existence of factions or special interest groups that try the rule and work of the nation's favor. The group opposing the Constitution's ratification were the Anti Federalists. Members such as Richard Henry Lee and Patrick Henry of Virginia were not as well organized in their rebuttals, but were still widely read. Arguments for ratification included standardized monetary supply, reduction of taxes, and repayment of the war bonds. Arguments against ratification included the fact that there was no Bill of Rights, this would be added in 1791, and that the Constitution provided a similar government system to Great Britain, to similar power struggles might follow, and that the ratification process was illegal under the Articles of Confederation. The assertion that the Constitution needed a Bill of Rights became the major argument of the Anti-Federalists against ratification. Once the Federalists realized that this was the biggest obstacle, some of them suggested that states with concerns about the absence of Bill of Rights ratify the Constitution with the caveat that the Bill of Rights would be added later. The states and the Constitution. The small states did not have as many vocal opponents to the Constitutions as the larger states. However, without New York and Virginia ratifying the new government would be just a shell. Once they did it, it was a fait accompli. The new government was formed and the old was disbanded. New York was chosen as the site of the first capital. But was it necessary for the people's right to be listed in the Constitution? In the early months of the ratification debates, Anti-Federalists argued vehemently in favor of the Bill of Rights, while Federalists argued against it. Anti-Federalists argued as fellow Americans had fought the Revolutionary War to escape the tyranny of a central government in Britain, what was the start of a strong central government under the Constitution from acting in a tyrannical manner. Only by adding a Bill of Rights could Americans be protected against its possibility. Federalists argued as follows: since members of Congress would be elected by the people, they need not to be protected against themselves. Furthermore, it was better to assume that all rights were protected than to create a limited list of rights, since unscrupulous officials could then assert their own unlisted rights could be violated at will. But in order to win ratification, the Federalists, as the first order of business of the newly elected Congress, the promise of Bill of Rights was also made. States were most likely to ratify it. This chart indicates the ratification of the Constitution, Delaware being the first state on December 7, 1787, with New Hampshire voting for ratification on June 21, 1788. The Constitution was now the government document. However, as said before, unless the bigger states come through, it wouldn't work. Finally, Virginia, New York, and North Carolina would ratify the Constitution. And pesky little Rhode Island, that was always a pain in the neck, finally realized, well, there's no way they could probably last as their own independent country. They would be the last ones to ratify the Constitution. So looking at America in 1789, hosting almost 4 million people and stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, the eastern seaboard, and the mighty Mississippi River, the United States has experienced economic and demographic growth on a large scale. The differences between the agrarian society in the South and the shipping-focused North continued to increase. The first Congress on the newly ratified Constitution convened on March 4, 1789 in New York. President George Washington was inaugurated in New York City shortly thereafter on April 30th. As the first president of the United States, Washington appreciated the delicate position he was in, for everything he did would be looked upon by future generations as a precedent for further actions. Washington's reputation and previous leadership helped ensure that he was elected unanimously, even though he did not want the job. In order to fulfill his role as chief executive, Washington established his cabinet, which was composed of the leaders of the executive departments. The Department of State is responsible for the diplomatic matters of the United States, and the first Secretary of State was Thomas Jefferson. The Department of Treasury is the chief banker of the United States and was first overseen by Alexander Hamilton. The Department of Justice was the dominion of the Attorney General, and Anthony Rednoff would be the first Attorney General. And the Department of War, which would be in charge of the defense of the nation, was under the leadership of Henry Knox. The Supreme Court was the only court created by the Constitution, and the only member specifically mentioned was the presiding officer, the Chief Justice. Congress was given the authority to create as many levels as jurisdiction of courts and many justices and judges as deemed necessary. Washington selected John Jay as the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. It's important to know who was the first. To calm fears about an overbearing national government, the Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution to ensure that the rights of the citizen, as well as the state and the new government. It was ratified in 1791. When the Constitution was ratified, the United States was the only nation in the world that did not, in some form, sponsor a set religion or mandate some of its religious requirements to hold office. In the First Amendment, Congress was forbidden from endorsing a religious or preventing others from worship as they saw fit. The Constitution authorized Congress to create policies regarding the immigration and naturalization of citizens. George Washington held that the nation needed to embrace new immigrants and refugees and urged Congress in his first address to the legislative branch in 1790 to set as a priority. The Naturalization Act of 1790 stated that free white persons could become a citizen after living in the nation for at least 2 years. This helped to result the arrival of around 100,000 European immigrants to the United States in the 1790s. However, those not considered to be free and white were excluded by this legislation. Individual states were left to determine whether or not free blacks were considered citizens in their states. In addition, since the Constitution did not consider Native Americans, who were not taxed, to be citizens, they were excluded from citizenship until an act of Congress in 1924 changed this, and even American women had gained the right to vote by that point. Hamilton's vision of a prosperous America. Alexander Hamilton embraced the ideas discussed by the Scottish philosopher Adam Smith in his An Inquiry into the Nature and the Causes of the Wealth of Nations. Although the term capitalism was not coined until 1850, the idea emerged during this period, what would be called the capitalist economy. Unlike the mercantilistic economy, was characterized by less government interference in the marketplace. By this logic, individuals and companies were supposed to be allowed to compete without government interference for profits. Smith argued that competition for profits would, in a sense, provide a check on poverty because individuals could use their hard work and ingenuity to find ways to help themselves and their loved ones. He contrasted this free enterprise with its mercantilistic and welfare systems in Britain at the time, in which the poor were disadvantaged by certain laws and economic circumstances. In addition, Smith argued that the competition in free enterprise would help all major sectors of the economy to flourish, rather than favoring one or two over the others. Hamilton based many of his ideas as Secretary of the Treasury on Smith's Wealth of Nations and other Enlightenment philosophers and the growth of the market economy. He is a man that had pulled himself up by his bootstraps and was a firm believer in the national economic policy that would strengthen the role of the central government while enriching the nation's economy. Originally, the only method Congress had of raising money was by placing taxes on imports. This is known as a tariff. Taxing on an individual's income would not come until the 20th century in the form of the 16th Amendment. As Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton won approval to absorb all the states' individual wartime debt, along with that of the national governments. So by the time paying them off as one debt, the establishment of the National Bank along the lines of the Bank of England would bolster the economy of the United States and provide an excellent credit rating for the new nation. The downside to Hamilton's plan was that it would strengthen the hand of the northern shippers and merchants in the government over those of the agrarian South. His plan became the first to illustrate the sectional differences in the nation between North and South. The Bank of the United States. Having won the debt payment debate, Hamilton would move to his vision of a national bank to control the monetary supply. His vision was that of a centralized banking authority that would allow the government to prevent the inflation or deflation of the dollar. However, the power to create a bank was not specifically mentioned in the Constitution, and the debate that emerged was the first great debate on constitutional interpretation to be heard in Congress. In the end, the bank was approved. Those who, like Hamilton, argued that Congress did have the power to create a national bank, focused their arguments on Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, the power to tax. Where else are you going to put this money if Congress taxes the nation? Jefferson and his anti-bank supporters took a stricter constitutional interpretation, meaning if it doesn't specifically say you can't do it. Whereas Hamilton and his pro-Bank of the United States supporters took a looser constitutional interpretation. Encouraging manufacturers. As part of the mercantilistic system of Great Britain, the American colonies have been forbidden from developing a manufacturing base. Once that symbolic relationship was severed, it was imperative that the United States develop such a base in order to survive. In order to encourage this growth, the price of items being imported that had a local competitor had to be kept higher so that the local market could grow until they were able to stand on its own. Hamilton won the creation of protective tariffs to do this. Thanks to Hamilton's vision and drive, the war debts were paid off. A manufacturing base was burgeoning, and once again, foreign credit began to flood into American markets. Federalists and Democratic Republicans. Although successful, the heavy-handed manner and what some viewed as unconstitutional actions of Hamilton to secure the National Bank and to pay off war debts led to the creation of the first political parties. Hamilton and his followers created the Federalist Party, which promoted a strong central government. Jefferson and James Madison, who opposed Hamilton's view, created the Republicans, or Democratic Republican Party. They stood for the rights of the states and a strict reading of the Constitution. Foreign and domestic crisis. A firestorm of controversy greeted Jay's treaty in America. Opponents of the treaty rioted and burned Jay in effigy. Originally, the French Revolution was viewed in the United States as an action similar to their own in 1776. All that changed in 1792 when France declared war on Prussia and Austria and began to slaughter their nobility. This caused problems in the United States because the Treaty of Alliance with France that was signed in 1778 stated that these two countries were perpetual allies and were obligated to defend each other. Some Americans, however, argue that they had made a treaty with the French monarchy, which was overthrown during the French Revolution. Therefore, they did not have to honor the treaty's obligations. Washington's proclamation of 1793 declared that the United States would remain neutral in the European wars and that any citizen caught aiding in these wars would be prosecuted. This was an attempt to avoid the United States being pulled into another conflict between France and Great Britain and to allow U.S. merchants to continue trading with both nations. The French diplomat to the United States in the early days of the French Revolution was citizen Edmond Genet. Genet had begun hiring privateers to attack Spanish Florida and harass British ships. Washington worried that Genet's actions would lead to America's entrance into the war against England, which he did not want, and demanded Genet's recall. By the time the demand reached France, some revolution had swept out Genet's supporters, and his arrest was ordered. Genet had begged for asylum to prevent being returned. In the efforts to soothe relations with Great Britain while securing promises to pull British forts out of the Ohio River Valley, John Jay was sent to England. His negotiations secured very few of the demands of Congress, and his treaty, though offensive to many, was ratified to avoid embarrassment abroad.
Frontier tensions. Indian resistance initially blocked white entry into the Northwest Territory north of the Ohio River. American troops suffered 2 defeats, leading Western settlers to feel abandoned by the government. They supported the French cause and the free and open navigation of the Mississippi River. President Washington would send General Mad Anthony Wayne into the Northwest Territory in 1793 to protect settlers from Native Americans who insisted that they had not agreed to the Treaty of Paris of 1783 and the British had no right to give away their lands. Wayne's troops and Native American allies faced a Western Confederacy of about 2,000 Shawnee, Ottawa, Chippewa, Delaware, and Potawatomi Indians and their British and Canadian supporters at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. In the end, the Americans proved victorious and agreed to sign the Treaty of Grenville on August of 1795. In this treaty, the Native Americans surrendered their lands and agreed to move west of the boundary line that was supposed to be a clear boundary between the Indian and American territories. In many ways, the Indian policy of George Washington's administration mirrored that of King George III because it tried to separate territories from the two groups. If Americans had adhered to the Treaty of Grenville, future U.S. Native American relationships might have turned out differently. However, settlers continued to move westward and violate the treaty line. Further administrations, beginning with Jefferson, persisted in the view that the U.S. claimed lands were open to white settlers, which only led to further conflict. This map shows the United States at the time of 1784 to about 1800. And as you can see here, the various number of lands that had been ceded according to Native American treaties with the United States to this area and also onto the eastern part. This is mostly Cherokee territory as well. But I should also note is that the British forts never left this Ohio Valley region. And we're going to see how this is going to have a future impact between the United States and Great Britain. The Whiskey Rebellion. Congress, at Hamilton's request, had levied a tax on whiskey in 1791, which angered farmers for whom it was their principal product. At the time, it was easier to move jugs of whiskey across the Appalachian Mountains than it was mere sheaves of wheat. The farmers feared that this was another attempt to fleece the poor to subsidize the rich. Events erupted in 1794 in western Pennsylvania, where federal revenue officers were being terrorized. The spirit of '76 and local liberty versus the national order. Washington called out the militia and 15,000 troops, but by the time they got there, the rebels had vanished. A few were captured and marched in irons through Philadelphia, but the rebellion had ended, although 2 were convicted for treason. In May of 1795, Washington would pardon them. Thomas Jefferson's reaction believed that Washington had went too far, but Hamilton saw it as a different view, that by using the force of the government to put down a rebellion, which the government was able not to do when you looked at Shays' rebellion. This is also the last time and only time that a president of the United States wore a military uniform. Pickneys Treaty. The Treaty of San Lorenzo, or Pickneys Treaty, October 1795. One positive result of Jay's Treaty was this one between the United States and Spain, who feared that the U.S. was about to come to terms with Great Britain. Differences regarding the southern and western boundaries and free navigation by the Americans of the Mississippi were adjusted. United States Minister to Great Britain, Thomas Pickney, achieved Spanish recognition of the U.S. boundary claims under the Treaty of 1783. The Mississippi to the west side, the 31st parallel to the south, and free navigation in the Mississippi, with the right to deposit goods at New Orleans duty-free for 3 years. In Pickney's Treaty of 1795, Thomas Pickney secured the use of New Orleans and the land north of the 31st parallel to the Tennessee River and west to the Mississippi. Western settlements. With the Land Act of 1796, Congress extended the rectangular survey of land that had been accepted in 1785 and agreed to sell at $2 per acre, with 640 acres being the minimum sold, as well beyond the means of almost farmers. It was not until 1800 when it was revised to 320 acres minimum and a down payment was allowed that it became affordable. In 1795, Daniel Boone expanded the Native American Trail between the Appalachian Mountains, known as the Cumberland Gap, and opened what has since become the Wilderness Road. This allowed for easier access to the backcountry and for the flow of goods and settlers into the area east of the mountain range. Transfer of power. George Washington and the Marquis de Lafayette at Mount Vernon in 1784 is shown in this painting here. Washington enlarged the estate, which overlooked the Potomac River, to nearly 8,000 acres, dividing it among 5 farms. But after serving 2 terms in office, Washington was ready to retire. In his farewell address to the nation, he called for the American citizens to forego political parties, as well as to avoid entangling alliances with the foreign nations. Washington believed that political parties will tear the nation apart, and that political parties would be more interested in the power of the party than what's doing good for the country and the government. In all 3 elections for president prior to 1804, the candidates with the second highest number of votes would become vice president. After the 1800 election, this was discontinued and replaced with a process outlined in the 12th Amendment. In the 1796 election, John Adams won the presidency, and Thomas Jefferson became vice president, even though they were of 2 different parties. The Adams administration. Political philosopher and politician, Adams is the first president to take up residence in the White House in early 1801. By the time Adams came into office, the United States was in an undeclared war with France. Over 300 American ships had been plundered by French ships, and the United States had broken off diplomatic relations with the former ally. In the effort to prevent a declared war, Adams sent a delegation to France to seek a diplomatic end. Before the delegation was allowed to meet with their French counterparts, 3 French officials, who Adams named X, Y, and Z in his report to the Congress, demanded a bribe before they would gain an audience. When this became known in the United States, it was greeted with a cry for war with France. French officials, realizing their mistake, apologized. To counteract what was conceived as a Republican attempt to undermine his presidency, Adams signed the following acts, thus committing the greatest mistake of his presidency and therefore dooming any chance for re-election. The Naturalization Act changed the time period to become a citizen from 5 to 14 years of residency, since most people who were becoming citizens were voting for the Republicans, not the Federalists. The Alien Act empowered the presidency with the ability to deport dangerous aliens. And the Aliens Enemies Act was designed to expel from America enemy aliens at will during a time of war. The Sedition Act forbade writing, publishing, or speaking ill of the government or its officers. Of course, this could be looked upon as, violations of the First Amendment. This contemporary cartoon shows Republican Matthew Lyon in the center with the fire tongs fighting against Roger Griswold, a Connecticut Federalist. The brawl in Congress on February 17, 1798, revealed the depth of the feelings that now divided the Republicans and the Federalists. Matthew Lyon showed the public's discontent with the Federalists and was reelected while he was unjustly jailed under the Sedition Act for speaking out against the Adams administration. The Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. 2 states, Virginia, led by James Madison, December of 1798, and Kentucky, drafted by Thomas Jefferson, 1798-99, passed resolutions invoking the compact theory of government, where the national government exercised powers not specifically delegated to it. Each state has an equal right to judge for itself. In other words, the resolutions advocated the right of the state to declare national acts unconstitutional and declared the Alien Sedition Acts unconstitutional. Although no way yet existed to test the constitutionality of congressional acts, it was generally felt that the states could not. No other state joined them in the similar actions, and several northern states suggested that the judiciary was an exclusive arbitrator of constitutionality. Both states reaffirmed their amendment to the Union, and no other action was taken. The election of 1800. The Federalists portrayed Jefferson as a godless revolutionary, an atheist, and a Jacobin, who, if the godless Jefferson was elected, murder, robbery, rape, adultery, and incest will be often taught and practiced. The Republicans claimed and portrayed Adams as a monarchist, determined to undo the revolution, and claimed that John Adams was a hideous, hermaphroditical character with neither the fitness of a man or a gentleness of a sensibility of a woman, adding that he was bald, crippled, toothless, and wants to start a war with France. By associating their Federalist opponents with the hated Tories of the American Revolution, the Republicans appealed to the voters as the true defenders of American liberation. The Republicans developed strong party organization and mobilized voters. Voter turnout in 1800 doubled that of the early 1790s, and most new voters were Republicans. A lot of this had to deal with the power behind Aaron Burr and his New York political party machine. When the members of the Electoral College met and were given 2 votes each, instead of voting twice for Jefferson, they cast one ballot for Jefferson for president, and one ballot for Burr, thinking to elect him as vice president. However, the final tally was 73 electoral votes for Jefferson and 73 electoral votes for Burr. It was a tie, and Burr wouldn't step down. Now, since there was not a majority, the vote had to go to the House of Representatives. In the House of Representatives, it became very heatedly debated behind closed doors. Each state was able to cast one vote for president, and it actually took Jefferson's political enemy, Alexander Hamilton, to convince the New York members of Congress to cast their vote for Jefferson, because Hamilton hated Burr so much and said, at least Jefferson has values. So Jefferson became president and Burr his vice president. The Federalist Party was now fragmented and weakened. And here this map depicts the final electoral vote on the election day before it went into the House of Representatives, where it was finally resolved by the House of Representatives. And so this concludes our study of the formation of the First Republic and the first government under the Constitution.